First and foremost, I want to say thank you to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If it wasn't for him, none of this would be possible. So with that being said, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and we're going to cook. We're going to talk real boxing. We're going to talk about the state of Puerto Rican boxing, the past, the present, and the future. And speaking of the future, we're going to talk Shakur Stevenson as well. That's right, Shakur Stevenson and Puerto Rican boxing. That's how I'm carrying it tonight. Everybody in boxing knows that Puerto Rico has produced so many great fighters throughout the years. Puerto Rico is a tiny island, and yet and still, Puerto Rico is a rival to Mexico. In boxing, there have been 4 specific nations that produce the best fighters out of the Latinos. That's Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Argentina, excuse me. But Puerto Rico and Mexico has had a historic rivalry throughout the years. And that's another topic for another video. Now, Puerto Rican fighters are not specifically tied to a specific style of fighting. For instance, Mexican boxers are known for Mexican style of fighting. Come forward, willing to take in order to give. They like to come inside, dig their left hook to the body. The infamous Mexican liver shot. Now, Puerto Rican fighters, Puerto Rican greats, throughout the years have different styles. You know, different styles. The last great Puerto Rican champion we had, Miguel Cotto, was a pressure, come forward fighter that likes to work behind a stiff jab and rips to the body. Very similar to a Mexican style fighter. But Miguel Cotto also had Olympic pedigree. So when he had to bounce on his toes and move around the ring, he would do so. Felix Tito Trinidad was a tall welterweight who was a come forward pressure, boxer puncher, who would set up his big punches by throwing that straight right hand as a throwaway shot to set you up for that big left hook, right? Then you have Alfredo Gomez, who was a boxer puncher, but with one punch knockout power. Then you have Alfredo Benitez, one of the slickest defensive fighters of all time. Alfredo Benitez is in the Guinness Book of World Records. That man was a world champion at 17 years old. That's something that we may never see again. Alfredo Benitez is among the greatest defenders of all time, along with Pernell Whitaker, along with Floyd Mayweather Jr., James Toney, and Willie Pep. Alfredo Benitez will move his head just by a fraction of an inch just to make you miss. It was nothing fancy. It wasn't like Floyd or Pernell Whitaker or James Toney. He would just move his head just enough to make you miss. Watch his fight with Tommy Hearns. He was slipping and dipping and making Tommy Hearns miss with so many shots. Alfredo Benitez is similar to Shakur Stevenson, who I'm going to talk about in a little while, because he moves his head just enough to make you miss by a fraction of an inch. Nothing fancy, but highly effective. Speaking of styles, we also had Hector Macho Camacho Sr., God rest his soul. Hector Camacho arguably is the most athletically gifted Latino fighter of all time. Arguably one of the greatest and most athletically gifted fighters, period. Camacho had legs for days. Probably one of the best footwork ever. The guy could bounce around on his toes for 12 rounds. Camacho could be out of range and then jump in range and get his shots off and jump right back out. He had blistering hand speed and decent punching power. Camacho was also one of the greatest combination punchers of all time. So I just listed different styles between great fighters from Puerto Rico, right? The last great Puerto Rican champion we had from the island of Puerto Rico was Miguel Cotto, right? And this is the longest amount of time that Puerto Rico has went without having an elite level world champion pound for pound type of fighter. Because Puerto Rican fighters, Puerto Rican greats always come out of nowhere, all the time. In the late 70s and early 80s, you had Wilfredo Gomez, Wilfredo Benitez, Esteban de Jesus. Later on in the 80s, we had the emergence of Hector Macho Camacho and Edwin Rosario, right? When they fizzled out, Felix Tito Trinidad bursted upon the scene. When Felix Tito Trinidad was on his way out, that's when Miguel Cotto came on the scene. And when Miguel Cotto was on top, we had other champions such as Juan Manuel Lopez, otherwise known as Juan Ma Lopez, as well as Ivan Calderon. But Miguel Cotto was the one that stood out the most. Miguel Cotto was the only Puerto Rican fighter to be a world champion in 4 different weight classes. But after Miguel Cotto fizzled out, we had a few prospects here and there, but they did not measure up to the potential, to the hype, to the expectations, such as Felix Verdejo, who was an Olympian, who was a rival to Vasil Lomachenko and lost to Lomachenko in a highly competitive fight in the Olympics. But he did not turn out to reach the potential and the expectations that fans had for him. So basically, after Felix Verdejo's buzz fizzled out, Puerto Rico did have another world champion after a while. Puerto Rico had a world champion by the name of Alberto Machado. But Alberto Machado did not hold on to the title for long. He eventually lost that fight, and he was never the same fighter. One thing that Felix Verdejo, Alberto Machado, Juan Ma Lopez, and Ivan Calderon have in common, they all took devastating losses against Mexican fighters. Mexico and Puerto Rico has a very historic rivalry in the sport of boxing, very competitive. And that's for another topic, that's for a whole nother video. Now, the next 2 Puerto Rican fighters that came on the scene that are elite level fighters after Miguel Cotto are Danny Swift Garcia and Shakur Stevenson. Danny Garcia and Shakur Stevenson have a few things in common. For one, both of these guys are not Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico. Both fighters are American-born Puerto Ricans. Danny Garcia is a Philly Rican. Shakur Stevenson is half African-American, half Puerto Rican out of Newark, New Jersey. That's one thing right there they have in common. Another thing they both have in common is Shakur Stevenson and Danny Garcia have winning records against the Mexican fighters in this historic rivalry. Both Garcia and Stevenson are undefeated against Mexican fighters. Danny Garcia has victories over Brandon Rios, Adrian Granados, Eric Morales, Robert Guerrero, and most recently, Jose Benavidez. Shakur Stevenson has victories over Oscar Valdez and Joet Gonzalez. Now, both fighters being half American and half Puerto Rican, personally, to me, they deserve all the backing of the Puerto Rican fans. Because at the end of the day, they're the only ones that have beaten Mexican fighters in the legendary head-to-head rivalry. Danny Garcia been around longer than Shakur Stevenson. He's closer towards the end of his career. Danny Garcia was a 2-division world champion, unified at 140 pounds. He won some fights against fighters that he was actually the underdog. He won the title at 147, and his only 3 losses to Keith Thurman, Sean Porter, and Errol Spence were all tough, competitive fights. Me personally, I had Danny Garcia beating Sean Porter. Now we're going to talk about Shakur Stevenson. In other words, El Shakur. El Shakur, ese tipo, heavy duty. No jode. Heavy duty. Anyway, Shakur Stevenson is a highly skilled fighter. Shakur Stevenson is a southpaw, and he's an expert at measuring distance and measuring range. He likes to keep the lead hand out, but from a southpaw stance, to set you up for that stab straight to the body. Shakur Stevenson probably is the best combination puncher in boxing right now. Arguably the best defensive fighter in boxing right now. And what Shakur Stevenson has in common with the great Wilfredo Benitez is his movement, his head movement is very subtle. His defensive skills are not flashy like Pernell Whitaker or a Floyd Mayweather Jr. His defense is very subtle, just like Wilfredo Benitez. He will move his head just enough to make you miss by a fraction of an inch. He'll slip to the side, roll underneath, keep his hands up, keep his distance. Very fundamental, very fundamental. Shakur Stevenson is at 135 pounds right now. In his weight class, between 135 and 140, he has young, tough fighters there, and veterans as well. He got Lomachenko, who's a vet. He got Devin Haney, a young gun. He got Ryan Garcia, who's a young gun. He got Teofimo Lopez, who's a young gun. And then he got Gervonta Tank Davis. Shakur Stevenson has the potential to beat all of these fighters and probably go down as the greatest Puerto Rican American fighter of all time. And if Shakur Stevenson was actually from the island of Puerto Rico and he was to go and fight and beat all these fighters, he probably would go down as the greatest Puerto Rican fighter of all time. Now, Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Davis, to me, that's the biggest fight in boxing somewhere down the road. That's a mega pay-per-view event that I believe can do over 1 million pay-per-view buys. Both Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Davis have the hip-hop following of the African-American fan base backing them up. But Shakur Stevenson also has the Puerto Rican fan base backing him up. So that will make for a mega fight. Now, as for Puerto Ricans from the island of Puerto Rico, we still have hope. We still got young Xander Zayas, who's making noise, but it's still early in his career. We got Edgar Berlanga. Speaking of Edgar Berlanga had a lot of buzz behind him because he was about 15-0 with 15 first-round knockouts. But after his last 4 performances, he did not look that good. And his stock sort of went down. Hopefully, for his sake, he could turn it around. But as for Shakur Stevenson, we have to back Shakur Stevenson up. He's a hell of a fighter. He lives a clean lifestyle. He's always in the gym. And he's very marketable. Ese tipo boricua, pa que tú lo sepa, you already know. So with that being said, I just had to give you a quick, brief breakdown of the history of Puerto Rican fighters from the past, the present, and the future. It was a pleasure speaking boxing with y'all. Hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. Until next time, I'm out.